Okay. Hey everybody, I'm back. So where I was when I had to stop there was talking about the idea of being an esthetician and about how for it's hard for us to think about things like this because in our world it's almost laughable. I hate to say that, but it's almost laughable, especially when we think of how much stuff out there we could look at as being vulgar. Like, a lot of people look at certain types of music and they think it's vulgar. They look at certain types of movies or TV and they think it's vulgar. They look at certain artwork and they think it's vulgar. Um, for a long time, um, the objective of art was not necessarily to be like visually pleasing or stimulating. It was to teach a lesson. The word is didactic. Artwork was supposed to be didactic. What it was supposed to do was teach you a lesson or make you a more moral person. I would argue that, you know, most of us today, not that most people are readers, but let's say, I was reading a book. I'm probably not reading a book to walk away from it being a more upstanding person. I'm walking away from reading a book to be entertained by it or to kill time. Um, Maybe aside from, let's say, if you're like me and you're a Christian, aside from maybe reading the Bible or reading like a correspondence of the Bible, then yeah, I would say you probably are reading for a moral purpose. But um, um, most of us don't. Most of us don't go out to the movie theater and watch a movie with the objective of returning back home being an improved person or having our value systems be greatly increased by what we have watched. Um, it's just not really in our mind frame. And the reason I'm bringing this up to you is to let you know that, like, for example, Oscar Wilde being an esthetician was probably not something that would have been embraced, a century earlier. Um, People probably would have looked at him and gone, this guy's crazy or this guy's off his rocker. Whereas we look at it today and what we think is people who go to watch a movie so that they can be morally edified are the ones who are off their rocker. I mean, that's craziness. Why? Who does that? Well, it just goes to show you that, things come full circle. And one of the things about Wilde that made him such a probably a polarizing sort of figure was that it wasn't just that he preached these things, he lived these things. Um, this is a man who was married heterosexually, married to a woman, yet had sexual trysts with men. He was bisexual, in other words. Um, some historians, and I don't want you walking away from this class saying Dr. Root said this is the truth. I don't know, but I believe in disseminating information and letting my students go find out for themselves if they want to, whether or not it's legit. Some even said that he was a pedophile. Now, that leads to an important sort of an epoch, meaning a period in history or a point in time um, of Wilde's life. And that was when he had to go on trial for sodomy. Now, I don't want to get into gross detail of what sodomy is, but in our world, I think sodomy is probably a different it probably takes on a different connotation than it did in Wilde's day. I'm not familiar with the English laws of the 1890s. Um, I think when they, meaning the government, charged him with sodomy, I think more what they were doing was looking at that he was having an inappropriate relationship with someone that was maybe not of a consenting age. And unfortunately for Wilde, the young man that he fell in love with, Lord Alfred Douglas, was very highly connected. His father was the Marquis of Queensberry. Those of you who don't know who that is, he's actually the one who came up with the formal rules of boxing, the ones that we still go by today. They may be modified a little bit, but he's the one that came up with them. So he was kind of a badass. You can understand then why a man with a reputation of being a badass would not want rumors or truth that his son was running around with an older man, and they were gay lovers. So he was very adamant that Wilde be brought to trial for this. And because he was a heavy hitter, I don't just mean like literally, because he was a heavy hitter, meaning he was a powerful person, he was able to make that happen. When they brought Wilde to trial, that's almost like a freestyle. When they brought Wilde, they brought him to trial. Sorry. I like to freestyle on the side. When they brought him to trial, it's probably one of the first really recorded examples of what would be considered like a jury trial type of thing, where circumstantial evidence actually convicted a person. See, nowadays, like in our court system, circumstantial evidence can help you make a case, but if all you have is circumstantial evidence, you're like 99% of the time, you're not going to convict somebody. Okay. Well, the circumstantial evidence they had was really twofold. The first one was there were some letters that Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas, his nickname for Lord Alfred Douglas was Bosie for some reason. That was, I guess, like a pet name for him. They had some letters, and I guess they construed what they would out of those. The contents of those letters, I don't know. I don't imagine Wilde was very intelligent. I don't imagine him being foolish enough to write anything in there that could have been used to indict him. So what I mean is there may have been things in there where he may have written like, I love you, or I miss you, or I adore you. But as far as writing things in there about like if they were doing anything that was, again, inappropriate sexually, I highly doubt Wilde would have been writing about those things in any kind of detail. So the point I'm making is that's also circumstantial evidence. I mean, again, they didn't have video cameras then. They didn't have tape recorders. I mean, unless you got people, confessing stuff, you never really knew if, when somebody's producing something that's like a work of art, and letters are. I mean, I realize we don't live in a world now where men typically woo women anymore with like sonnets, like Shakespeare's sonnets, or with love poems. But any of you guys out there who ever tried to woo a young lady by writing her a letter, what I'm getting at is you lay it on pretty thick like you're icing a cake. I mean, you're going to have to put some stuff in there that's going to sound a little bit fake in order to really try to impress the woman, almost certainly. I mean, it's just kind of a trope. It's kind of a tradition. Okay. Well, where I'm going with this is that doesn't mean everything you're putting in the letter is true. I mean, you could write to some woman and say, well, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. And secretly, maybe you think Beyonce is the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. Well, okay, that would mean you're lying in your letter. Your letter is basically becoming a piece of art. Okay, well, that was one thing they had to use against him. The other one, and this is the most circumstantial, they used his own writing against him. So they looked at things like, for example, Oscar Wilde wrote a story called The Picture of Dorian Gray. And Dorian Gray was a really disturbing story about a guy who he couldn't come to terms with the fact that he was aging, like, and that his appearance would change. And so essentially what he had done was he met up with this guy who was sort of like I don't want to say like a sorcerer, but he was like a portrait painter who I guess had some sort of like secret powers. And the guy basically told Dorian Gray, well, I'll paint this picture of you. And in exchange, basically what it's going to do is it's going to immortalize you. And so Dorian Gray was like, well, what do you mean? And the portrait painter said, well, I'm going to make this painting of you, and your appearance will never change. But anything bad that you do is going to change the painting. The painting is going to reflect your life. Your face won't reflect it. Well, because Dorian was so vain, he was like, well, that's fine. As long as I keep looking pretty, looking handsome, looking fly, that's fine if the painting changes. Well, Dorian was not a good person. He was going around, like he used drugs, he drank heavily, he ran around with a lot of women. Every time he did something that was morally wrong, the face that was in the painting got more and more twisted and warped. Okay, so again, it's kind of a metaphor. Well, again, the thing about artwork is a lot of times people have a mistaken idea that artwork is always autobiographical in some way. Meaning, like, if I was to write a story and there was a male lead character in it, there are people out there who would automatically assume that that male lead character is based on me. It may have nothing to do with me. But a lot of people assume that if I'm the one writing it and it's about a guy, then I have to be representative of that guy, or that guy has to be representative of me. And again, that's kind of where that art for art's sake thing that Oscar Wilde believed in came into play, and it actually kind of hurt him in the end. Because the whole thing about Wilde was, you see, he believed that appearances were the most important thing. And I know that what you're going to say is, but Dr. Root, wasn't that the Victorian era way? Yes. But what I mean by Wilde believing appearances were the most important thing was he had a different sort of view of it, where what his view was that your public appearance should be one way, and your maybe your private appearance is another. Quick kind of sidebar. When Ben Franklin wrote his autobiography, one of the things he talked about in it was how he didn't think his writing was very good, because when he was writing it, he was an old man. And what he said was, please excuse any of the defects in my writing, because one dresses differently for a private dinner than they do for a public ball. Okay, and what he was doing was making a metaphor about his writing. See, an autobiography in Franklin's mind was almost like a journal. He was sort of writing it for himself, or at least he said that he was. Okay, that's a whole different ball of wax. But what he was saying is, if I'm going to sit at home and write something for myself, it's not going to look the same as if I'm writing it for an audience. And Oscar Wilde, I think, believed the same thing. When he went out in public, it was almost like a performance for him. It wasn't necessarily the real Oscar Wilde. That's why if you read The Importance of Being Earnest, which obviously I'm having you read, you should latch on pretty quickly to that concept of sort of the double identity, the dual, almost a split personality. If when you're reading it, you think these people are out of their minds, Well, it's because that's a satire. Okay, it's a satire on Victorian England. Satire is just a simple literary term that means overstatement, hyperbole, exaggeration, stuff that's done to achieve an effect through that usage. And I think Wilde felt like when he went out into public, he had to be this sort of flamboyant, um, a fop, a dandy, maybe would be a good word for it. Um, and in his private time, again, like I wouldn't know what to say he was like in his private time because I don't know that he documented, that. But what he did believe in was appearances, and he also, I think, was one of the people who believed that there's no such thing as bad publicity. Okay. He was quoted saying one time, whether or not I walk down the streets of London with a lily, meaning a little purple flower, in my hand really is of no import. What's important is that people said I did it. In other words, as long as you're being talked about, you're relevant. It's when people are no longer talking about you, you're not relevant. You're not important anymore. And Wilde felt like as long as people were saying stuff about him, whether it made him look, again, it would probably depend on the community of people who were looking at him. I mean, if they were aesthetically inclined, they wouldn't have cared if he wore, outfits like Prince wore. Prince was very androgynous, very sort of metrosexual in his appearance. You know, most people, I would go so far as to argue, really didn't care because Prince was so talented and he was such a great musician that didn't matter. Well, what I mean is, I think it was kind of the same way with Wilde, where people knew he was such a good writer, and he really is. I mean, he really is a great writer. If any of you are interested in writing, in reading, or like I said, doing anything more with English, uh, I recommend Dorian Gray. It's one of my favorite novels, and I've read a lot of novels in my day. Um, I think Wilde, people still knew, no matter how he presented himself, whether it was weird, whether people were like, that's inappropriate or whatever, a lot of people still looked at him and said, yeah, but he's talented, and let's be honest, like talent can make up for a lot of shortcomings. I mean, it really can. And with Wilde, unfortunately, it all kind of came crumbling down. I mean, it came to a sad end for him because he was convicted of sodomy. He was sent to jail in France, and or well, maybe it was in France. I know that he spent the last few years of his life in France, and he basically distanced himself from like the literary community. He didn't write anymore. Um, I think jail, from what I've read, as I remember, I used to do some more research on Wilde than I've done in the last 10 or 12 years. Um, I think that being in jail kind of just took it out of him. He just kind of gave up that aspect of his personality, that the creative part. Um, and he basically ended up, traipsing around Paris, around France for the last couple of years of his life, living in like cheap hotels and boarding with, rooming with people that he knew. Um, my guess would be probably living a pretty foul lifestyle. If I remember correctly, he had quite a penchant for drinking. Um, I also want to say, if I remember correctly, he was also no stranger to using drugs. My guess would probably be opiates. What we today call like opioids, but a different form of it. It was smoked. Um, and he died of, if I remember correctly, he died of syphilis. And the syphilis that he died of was probably um, sexually related. Obviously today, we have so much more medicine, we can treat those things. But especially if he was, just at the point where he didn't care anymore, he probably didn't care that he had syphilis and that it was killing him. He may not have known. But typically, the way, like rabies, basically is in animals is a form of syphilis. Basically what ends up happening is like, it destroys your brain. That's why, like, a rabid dog, they really are insane. It's because their brain has been, it's been destroyed. Um, and that's what happens to people until it kills them. And that's how Wild's story came to an end. But that doesn't mean he didn't leave behind some great works. And I think one of the things that I want to stress before I end this lecture is, I always try my best to treat 201 Intro to Lit more like a literature appreciation course than I do a literature course where I'm going to drill you to death with terms. I don't usually really teach that way. It's not really my style to do that. I think much more often, if I can make you guys, or not make you, but if I can get you to leave my class appreciating literature, appreciating a piece of work, understanding it, getting the nuances of why it's considered a great piece of literature, even if maybe you don't like it. I'm not trying to force anything on you. If you don't like something, you don't like it. Don't think you have to. That's not what this course is about either. It's not about me twisting your arm. But if I can get you to understand why people look at a work like The Importance of Being Earnest today, and believe me when I tell you, there has been more than one work that has absolutely ripped off the premise of The Importance of Being Earnest. There's an episode of Seinfeld that did it. A Wilde probably even would have said, imitation is a sincere form of flattery. And a lot of people have tried to imitate Wilde, and I don't think very many have had luck doing it. He was just kind of an eccentric cat, like Ric Flair said, often imitated, never duplicated. Woo! Mean Gene. But when we look at The Importance of Being Earnest, and I'm going to stop here because I posted some stuff on the page for you to look at, and I don't want to sit here again and give you a lecture on it, because then there's no point in you reading it. But I do want you to look at those questions and think about them. Again, think about the idea of how much of what Wilde's doing is supposed to be ironic, and how much of it is actually supposed to be just ridiculous. Again, like, you may find that as you're reading a book, you have one opinion, and then when you finish it and you're able to look at it as a whole, your view changes. That happens a lot. There have been movies I've watched that start out really slow, and I'm pretty bored with them. By the time they end, I'm like, wow, that ended up being a pretty good movie. And my opinion changed. There are so many intricacies in this play to think about. Again, let me just throw some out there for you really quick that pop off the top of my head, and then I'm going to wrap this one up. Think about the idea of keeping a diary. And whenever Miss Prism, and I want to say it's Gwendolyn. Again, I'm bad with names, so it's probably just as well that we're all not meeting face to face, because I am bad with names. They're having a discussion about what a diary, like basically what a diary is, because both Cecily and Gwendolyn, they keep these diaries, and the diaries are fake. Like, when you're reading, you should be keying in on the fact that, like, the things they're writing about in the diaries never happened to them. They're made up. They're like fiction. And Miss Prism sort of lays into, I recall it being Gwendolyn, because Miss Prism is her tutor. And it may be Cecily. Again, I'm bad with names. But she basically says, there's no reason for you to keep a diary. Our memories are the diary that we all keep with us. So basically what she's telling her is, it's a waste of time to chronicle your thoughts in a diary. And we find out that Miss Prism at one point was a novelist herself and wrote a 3-volume novel. And again, I believe it was Gwendolyn, asked her, well, Miss Prism, how did your 3-volume novel end? Wilde is clearly poking fun at the way the Victorian era was viewed, because her answer is something like, the good ended as it should and the bad ended as it should. In other words, good things at the end of this story, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Well, Wilde, the whole time in this play, is blurring a line for you. I'm not John Cena. Wilde is blurring a line for you. The line that you should be actually, I think, experiencing a blur in while you're reading this is, who are the good characters and who are the bad ones? Or is anybody really good or really bad? Or are they both? Or again, are they people who are fundamentally good but they can be bad? Are they fundamentally be bad but they can be good? Again, like, what's Wilde trying to do with these characters? I mean, you even have a horny old reverend in there who says a couple of very cleverly written lines. I'm not going to give them away to you yet, but we have literally a cast of characters in here who run the gamut of being, it's almost like, this is probably the best way for me to end it. Wilde was a big idea of creating yourself, creating an identity. And through creating an identity, the one thing you have to remember is recreation becomes part of that. Because once you create an identity and everybody gets used to it, then you just become like dry bread. And then you have to recreate yourself so that you're not dry bread anymore, or else people get bored with you, right? I mean, think about it. How many of you in high school were a certain way and then you got to college and you changed because you knew that you could do that? You had the freedom to do that. In high school, chances are, after 1 or 2 years went by, you got typecast. Typecast, all that means is people placed you in a certain spot and that's where you were going to stay. You were sort of friends with who you were friends with. You sort of, socially, you were where you were. But when you got to college, you knew you could change that because people there didn't know you. Well, I think that was where Wilde stood on a lot of this stuff. Creation, self-creation, recreation, it's all part of the human experience. But the one thing I think Wilde wanted to show in the importance of being earnest, and here's where I'm going to wrap up, is when you can't separate reality from fantasy, you have a problem. And clearly these characters, satirically now, it's clearly done as in a joking way, but these characters, at least some of them, they don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between what's really happened and what they have created. And the problem is, when you create a fantasy world, what happens when reality interferes with it? And vice versa, when you're living in a real world, what happens when fantasy interferes with it? You can't. They can't coexist. They just can't. Not the way they do in this story. And that's why at the end, and I'm not going to give you the ending away, but that's why at the end everything comes crumbling down, because at the end of the day, what we find out, As my father used to say, I'll end with the quote of my dad: the truth does not need any embellishment. The truth stands on its own. And when the truth comes out, the truth will set you free. And at the end of this story, what we find out is all the BS aside, all the lies aside, all the acts aside, all the machinations aside, the truth will come out. And when the truth comes out, some people are going to be happy with it, some people aren't. Some people are going to have egg on their face, and other people aren't. And then the people who have been being forthright all along usually end up being the ones who are vindicated by a story, as opposed to the people who maybe have been putting on airs all along, Lady Bracknell, when the story ends. So that's where I'm going to wrap it. I hope that helps you some. I hope I'm not too dull or too boring. I didn't leave my dining room chair for 2 hours and 18 minutes earlier today because I had to do a lecture and then I had to do a conference call. So this has been another hour. I've been sitting, so I need to get up and stretch my legs. But I hope this helps you all. And again, if you have any questions about any aspect of the play or the assignments or anything like that, please just feel free to ask me. Just email me and let me know. Okay? Until then, be safe, be healthy, be happy, be good.